Okay, welcome. So what we're doing here in this lecture, in this video, is to talk about key vocabulary terms that deal with the analysis of literature. So if we frame this in the context of the introduction to the course, one of the focus is, why are we dealing with this vocabulary, you ask? Well, in the context of the course, one of our focuses is just developing skills of reading and interpretation. Which is another way of just saying developing the skills of careful reading and talking about a text in an intelligible and intelligent way. So if you're going to do that, you need the proper terms to talk about a work of literature. If you walked into a biology class, if you walked into an art history class, there would be a key set of terms that if you're going to analyze something or discuss a certain topic, you need to be conversant with. All these terms have to do with analyzing a text, and particularly a work of literature, particularly some form of narrative, right, like the novel. What does it mean to analyze? To analyze means to break something down into its component parts. So, strict definition, we could say analyze means to describe or explain. That's certainly true. But analysis is really a specific type of explanation. It literally means to break something down into its component parts in order to understand those parts in their distinct features and also how those parts fit together into the whole of a work of literature. A work of literature is a kind of structure. It's like an architectural structure that fits together in a certain way, or a machine, a well-oiled machine that fits together in a certain way that if you really want to understand its meaning, what's going on, you need to break it down into its component parts. So these terms are really kind of, some of them are really straightforward. You're going to be familiar. Key terms that you're going to need to know, and we're going to use in this class in perpetuity for the duration of the course. So therefore, when we start working at actual works of literature, we're going to be using these terms, and I'm going to expect that you're conversant with these terms so we don't have to, hey, professor, what does that mean? Well, we established at the beginning of the semester because we want to talk about, like, setting, right? Not a challenging one, right? But when I say, the setting, thus and so, talking in class, you need to know clearly. I want to know that everybody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's move forward here. This is the vocabulary that you will be quizzed on for Quiz 1. And let me say one thing now, that Quiz 1 is going to be a different format from quiz number 2. Quiz number 1 is vocabulary. Because this is an online course, I'm in the process of devising exactly what quiz 1 looks like, because in fact I've never given it online. I'm used to giving it in class, and it's a quiz that doesn't perfectly translate online. At least I haven't figured out the exact way that I'd like to do it. So this vocabulary is the vocabulary you're being tested for quiz 1. So here are the terms. And this PowerPoint will be posted as well, and I'm not going to read them all off here because we're going to see them in a moment. But this just lets you see up front what the key terms that you need to know for the quiz are, because then they're going to be in subsequent slides, broken up on different slides, not given to you all at once, but pretty clearly indicated in yellow, the terms that you need to know. So the first two terms are text and context. Text and context. And these terms here all come in the analysis of a text. What have I said analysis is? It's breaking something down into its component parts. If you take a text in terms of what it consists of, the first thing you can do in terms of breaking a text down into the component parts that make up the totality of the whole is a text and its context. The text, this is really not rocket science here. The text is literally the physical thing with the words on the page, right? That's the text. The context is the circumstance or situation in which you find the text or read the text or from which the text comes. The first context of a text, obviously, is the text from which it originates. The author writing in 1492 about Columbus sailing the ocean blue. And that the important thing is that context, that world of the context, that historical moment, comes with it all types of dispositions, points of view, cultural elements, ideological elements, maybe religious elements, maybe geographical elements that are different than the context in which you are reading the text. So the context acknowledges the different terrains or geographies or histories that a text travels through over time, right? Really, I think one of the most basic examples that makes it very clear is the Constitution. It was written in 1787, and it comes to us in 2020. And there are people today who say we have to reimagine what the Constitution means based on the world of the present, and this is a philosophical position of jurisprudence, of judges, like Supreme Court judges, federal judges. And then there are other judges who say, no, we need to understand these words of the Constitution, life, First Amendment right to free speech and assembly, or right to religion, or no establishment of religion. These need to be under these words and phrases and sentences. Their meanings need to be understood in the context of 1787, in what those thinkers and politicians were what they meant at that time. So then the context is, you could say, the thing that surrounds the text, or the thing in which the text is embedded, a historical moment in time and space, right? So then we take the text itself, right? And we can break any text down into its form and into its content. Its form and its content. The form of a text is simply the structure, the style, the format. It deals with how it's written, or you could say how something is said, right? And what you come to realize is that I can say the same thing in a variety of different ways, right? And then the question becomes, why did the author choose to present this message in this form, with this sentence first and this word first, rather than that word? Imagine some given statement. I can take some key terms, I can take a noun and a verb and all the connecting grammar, and I can probably say the exact same thing, but structure the grammar in a different way. And the question is, why is it being structured in the way that it is, and with an acknowledgement that it could be structured in another way? So the form is the structure of a text. I'll give you an example. Pulp Fiction. Most people have seen that movie, right? And you notice that the film does not begin at the beginning in terms of the structure of its chronology or its plot. It actually begins at the end. The opening scene of the movie turns out to be part of the last scene of the actual narrative, right? And you ask yourself, why did Quentin Tarantino do that? And maybe you have an answer, but the point is, he chose to do something very distinct because it grabs your attention. And then the question is, why was it structured in that way? The content is very simple. If the form is the how something is presented, the content is just the what. It's the subject matter. It's the meaning. It's the message that the author is trying to communicate to you, right? And of course, form, how something is communicated, also contributes to what's being said. If I say something in a certain way, it's going to lend toward a certain message rather than another one. So ultimately, form and content can't be completely separated, because how something is said it is saying something about actually what is being said. But in terms of analysis, we can just kind of superficially divide a text in between form and content. Next two words we're all familiar with from the previous lectures, dealing with two types of accounts, right? We said human beings are the account-giving animal because we have speech, because we have brains, because we have reason. We want and also need to explain the world to ourselves, and that is why storytelling seems to have such a profound grasp over the human imagination from time immemorial, right? Storytelling in various forms is clearly something more than just entertainment. We could say on the most basic level, it serves an evolutionary function, which is that it's part of the survival of the fittest. If we come to the conclusion that human beings have been particularly successful in proliferating biologically as a species across the planet, it has something to do with culture, and I would argue it has something to do with storytelling. Okay, so there's two types of accounts we're going to encounter. So here's the point I want to make about accounts, just for a second, that literature is not entertainment. Literature should be entertaining, but entertainment is really like a diversion, a divertissement. It's a distraction from reality. Literature does not take you away from reality. It actually, good literature, serious literature, it takes you toward reality. In fact, you see in it more than you can typically see in your everyday life for a whole variety of reasons. But there's two fundamental types of accounts we're going to encounter in this class, and I'm using the Greek words because I think they really capture the dimensions of what we're looking at, and this is the playing field on which we're working on in the ancient world in terms of the types of stories that we encounter. So mythos is just a Greek word for myth, but what does the word myth or mythos literally mean? It literally just means a story, right? Which isn't typically how we think of it. And in particular, that means mythos is a narrative account. It's an account that comes in the form of a story. A story and a narrative are just two words for pretty much the same thing. The key thing is an account is an explanation. And myth, let's be clear, particularly origin myths and myths from the ancient world, they actually serve a very specific purpose in terms of what they're trying to explain. And they're trying to explain, in the most general level, the mysteries of the human experience. And those mysteries are typically boiled down to three questions. And you will see when we read Genesis that these three questions occupy an absolutely central position and organize the narrative of the first three chapters of Genesis, and of course the rest of the Bible, but they're really clearly on display in the first three chapters. Central three questions are, who are we? And by we, meaning some people who are telling this myth to each other. And they're both explaining and describing their life. But if you're giving a description of someone's identity to a child, and as they grow, they're not simply having it described to them. They are starting to internalize it and become that identity that is described in the story. So who are we? What is this world? Right? Like, what is the totality? What is everything that there is? What is there? What does this world consist of? What is it like? Right? And then, importantly, what is our relationship to this world? And that relationship is going to depend on two things. And it's going to depend on who are we, and it's going to depend on what this world is. And normally there's going to be some kind of connection. We are going to be some type of derivative element of the world, right? So we're going to have features common with it and also features divergent from it. Like, so if you look at mankind in the story of Genesis, you see commonalities, and then you also see differences. We are connected, we are part of the natural world, but we also have the divine spark in us, which distinguishes us as human beings from other obviously plants and animals and anything else in nature. Another word for myth in the ancient world is just poetry. Really, poetry is the word used to describe, to talk about stories in the ancient world. It's the word that Greeks used. And their language really dominates our explanation of these types of literary things. And a myth tends to appeal to the heart. It tends to appeal to the emotions and passions. It presses those emotional buttons. It pulls the heartstrings. What will you? That doesn't mean that there isn't a crystalline rationale or logic working behind the story, but that on the surface it plays to your emotions in the same way music appeals to your emotions. You could say to your heart more than your head. So then a logos, and the concept of a logos, which logos literally means speech and reason, and the reason it means both is because the only way we can reason is through the medium of speech. Speech is a medium of communication, and it's also the medium of reasoning, which is to say thinking through things to try to come up with answers or understanding of the world around us, or what is the right course of action. We have to reason about what is there, and we have to reason about what do we do. Right? It's kind of a distinction between the theoretical and the practical. But a logos, then, is just a rational account. And these two, mythos, logos, they stand in opposition to one another, or in tension. Because the myth we would consider superstitious or fiction. It's not rooted in the facts, right? There's no fact-checking in myth, and there's all kinds of fantastical things that happen in myths that don't happen in the real world, miracles and whatnot. So a rational account is rooted in empirical evidence, and empirical evidence, the evidence of the five senses, it's the evidence that everybody else can refer to. One of the challenges of the Bible as an inspired work, inspired by God, is that nobody can see the evidence for the divine inspiration. It is a claim that people make and not to be dismissed, but producing evidence for that claim is rather challenging if we're expecting empirical or evidence of the senses, right? So an irrational account based on the evidence of the senses and bound by logic. Those are the two. In our class, you want to make an argument, you need to have evidence that we can all see, and you need to use logic that we all can accept, which is, basically the principle of non-contradiction. You can't contradict. Something can't both be and not be at the same time. It can't be a little this or a little that, right, at the same time. It's either one or the other. That's the principle of the excluded middle. It's connected with the law of non-contradiction. And in the ancient world, the logos, the rational account, becomes, if the mythos is associated with poetry, the logos gets associated with philosophy. And in ancient Greece, there is this fundamental tension between poetry on the one hand as the mode to explain the world to us, and philosophy on the other. And that will be a defining divide or distinction throughout the course. Okay, and so I'm not going to talk about this much other than to say that we looked at the historical development of authoritative human explanations of the world. And in the beginning, to use the language of Genesis, poetry and myth was the form or the genre through which people tried to explain everything to themselves, explain the world, explain their identity and their relationship to it. Over time, philosophy established its place with a new standard and a new object of inquiry, and then, of course, natural science. And you can see the tension between a logos and a mythos, or logoi and mythos. That's just plural. It's Greek, right? And that they divide on lines of fiction and nonfiction, right? And here are examples of the historical development of account giving, right? Okay, next to fancy Greek words. They're used actually in Plato's Republic to talk about ways of telling a story. And actually Plato's Republic is the first text in Western literature that addresses actually literary criticism. I'm not sure Plato would have called it literary criticism, but it falls under that category today within the university, right? So these two words, diegesis and mimesis, actually mean something pretty simple. And they have to do with two ways of telling a story. And once I explain them, you'll see that they're really, you already know what they are, but you just haven't used these words, right? Diegesis, it means narration, right? When you narrate a story, you're using diegesis. What does it mean to narrate? It means a third-party character tells about what happened to other people and recounts their actions and their words potentially, right? So narration does not depict events or speech directly. It has a third party who's potentially outside of the story, right? There's some stories where there's like an omniscient narrator. They're kind of like God. And they're not really a character directly in the story. They just speak about people from like some kind of Mount Olympus type view and show the characters on the stage of this story, acting out their roles, if you will, right? Of course, narrators can be involved in the story. The narrator could be the main character. The narrator could be a secondary character who's viewing the main character, right? So you can start talking about in narration, there's all these different points of view that could be taken on how the story is narrated. The narrator could be involved in the story. The narrator could basically be just the person telling the story, right? But the point is, when you're narrating, when you're using diegesis, you're telling it. You're telling it as opposed to showing it, to use those terms we used before. And you'll see the difference here, which is mimesis. First of all, very simply, the word mimesis means to imitate or imitation, right? So when you mimic something, right? When a monkey mimics something, they're imitating it. That's where the word, or the word mime. A mime imitates gestures and actions and behaviors. In this context, in the literary context, what we're talking about specifically is not just imitation as such, but the imitation of dialogue. And how do we know when an author is presenting the dialogue imitated? It's very simple. We see quotation marks. We see quotation marks. So you'll notice a narrator could say, Bob said on Thursday something like this, right? And it wouldn't be in quotation marks, and it would be the narrator's characterization of what Bob said. Or, if it's mimetic, the author would say, Bob said, comma, quotation, I'm going to the gym tomorrow, period, quote, end of quote, right? You see the difference. In mimesis, imitation of dialogue, it's as if the character is speaking directly to the reader or to the audience, if you imagine this in terms of a play. So if you think about it, a play, a drama, theater, right, is almost typically all mimetic. You have characters on stage speaking their lines where you do not typically have a narrator explaining what the characters are saying. The characters just come out and say it themselves. Of course, you know, a lot of plays you think of like, what is the play Our Town, where there's a stage manager, where there's basically the stage manager serves as a narrator. So it's not unusual or completely uncommon in plays to have a narrator, but typically it's almost all mimetic. And then there's the mixed style. Really fancy concept. No, not really. It just means this. It means the combination of narration with quotation or imitation of dialogue or mimesis, right? So I ask you a question. What does the modern novel use? Does it use narration, diegesis, or does it use the imitation of dialogue, mimesis? And the answer is typically some combination of both. It uses the mixed style. There's typically a narrator that characterizes actions and even speech, but then also characters speak directly because you see quotation marks to make that clear, right? And the whole concept of quotation marks indicates a verbatim statement, you know, from the person, right? So now we move on here to the parts of fiction, many of which you're going to be really familiar with, and this won't be any kind of aha, but it's kind of just a little refresher. And I'm going to add some nuances to these terms and some clarification that maybe in high school, grade school you didn't have, right? So a narrative, right? A narrative is just another word for a story. Narrative is just a story. But the important thing is plot and narrative side by side. They're similar, but they are certainly not the same. Narrative is the story told about events. What is a story? It's a representation in language of events, right? The narrative is not the events themselves. It is simply the story told about the events. So imagine, this morning I go out and catch a fish, and then I come home to my wife, and then I narrate the story of what I did in the morning, right? The narrative is what I told my wife. It's not actually what happened in the morning, and you notice that there's a gap between the narrative on one hand and the actual events on the other, right? The events are like the physical events in the world. The narrative is the story and language about them. So the plot refers to literally the events themselves and their structure, their chronology, right? And we know that, like, for example, narrative time is different than chronological time. The plot consists of chronological time. And by chronological time, I mean the tick, tick, tick of the clock, right? Chronological time only works in one way. It goes from 12 to 1 to 2, and then you come back to 12 again, right? Narrative time can work in almost any order that you want. In narrative time, you don't need to begin at the beginning. In real time, you wake up at the beginning of the day and you don't get to the end until you get to the end. In narrative time, you can rearrange those parts as you see fit. And this is going to be really important, particularly when we turn to the Odyssey, because the structure of the narrative is particularly unusual. The Odyssey is ostensibly the story of the journey of Odysseus home from Troy after the Trojan War. The irony is, in terms of the time in which we open up at the beginning of the tale, the Odyssey, epic poem, we are actually already at the end of Odysseus' journey. And the only way we hear about what happened on the journey is that it's narrated retroactively after it's actually happened, right? So when we open the page 1 of the Odyssey, most of the story has already happened. It's very interesting. The story does not begin at the beginning, is what I'm saying. It begins close to the end. So there are temporal issues with the relationship between plot and narrative. The next thing is they're not just temporal issues, there are interpretive issues, right? There's a wonderful film that I encourage everybody to see. It's a great work of film, and I would say it's a film, it's not a movie. Movie is entertainment, like a film entertains you, but it has like real sustenance for the heart and mind, right? So it's made by the famous filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, and it's called Rashomon, and the plot is very simple. A woman is accosted by a man, and this takes place in Japan, and 4 people see what has happened in this situation, right? So there's one simple plot. This man accosts this woman, 4 people see it. However, there are 4 narratives to that one plot told, each from the different perspective of the 4 characters who see this event. So this movie is not linear, it's actually cyclical. Instead of going from the beginning to the end of the plot in narrative time, we actually get the whole story once, then we get the whole story again, and the whole story again, and the whole story again 4 times. The same story is told 4 times, or the same event is narrated 4 times, right? And guess what? Each story is different. Why? Because each person who saw this has a different understanding of what actually happened, because they are just a witness. Like, this gets into the whole, like, how reliable are witnesses? And apparently, you know, in courts of law, criminal courts of law, eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. They have all kind of, you know, we all know, everybody's got all kinds of biases and dispositions of one kind or another, all kinds of pedestrian stuff. They think they saw something when maybe they actually didn't. So each character puts a certain spin on the plot through their narrative, right? And this captures something that Nietzsche, and I'm not a proponent of this line of thinking completely, but it certainly has its place. He says there are no facts, only interpretations, right? And what he seems to say is, yes, there are kind of fixed things in the world that are generating people's impressions, but what matters to us, what matters ultimately is the interpretations, and everybody has their own. And you'll notice this in the media. The media doesn't claim to be giving you the facts anymore. I don't know how careful you watch the news, but there was an interview with the Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Department of Justice, federal government. And he said, I knew there was something wrong when the media started talking about narratives instead of facts. And why is that? Because a narrative is just a story told about the facts that's spun in a certain way from a certain interpretive perspective, and it's not the facts themselves, right? So a narrative is just what you'd like to see, or what you think you saw, or it's taking the facts and putting them together in a yarn in a way that you'd like, but not necessarily in a factual way. Okay, so here are remaining terms. The first two we've already talked about, and I'm going to go through them expeditiously as we round third and head home, right? You know what? I don't even like baseball, but I do like that metaphor. Okay, so setting. Now, y'all know this from elementary school. The setting is the where and the when, right? But let's be very clear. If I say September 11th, 2001, downtown Manhattan, Wall Street, right? That's a time and a place. Now, all we need to say is 9/11, and so many associations are brought to mind. But the setting is more than just physical time and place. It's all the things and the events that come with that time and place that really flesh out its essence, its identity, its character, its personality. So setting includes, and this is really crucial, because this is what matters about the setting, all the cultural and historical context, the assumptions, the prejudices, the biases of that time and place, its habits, beliefs, its way of being, its way of life, its worldview, that really clarify what it's like to be in that world, right? So if I say September 11th, 2001, you know, downtown Manhattan, right, or Wall Street, all those associations of habit and culture and what's going on would come to mind to you. But if I said something like 499 BC, ancient Athens, many of you are just going to have a place, Athens, and a date. And it might not mean much to you at all. And that's the point. What really matters about that time and place is the fabric of the life that goes on there. So, for example, for the quiz, it's clear that you understand that setting is more than just the time and place. It's what goes on at that time and place, what it's like to be there. Number 4, characters, right? Just the people involved. And of course, there are protagonists who are kind of the central positive figures, or the heroic figures, the good figures. There's the antagonists, the ones in opposition to the protagonist. There are main characters and secondary characters and so on and so forth. One thing for our purpose that we might keep in mind is that the various characters, you know, span the gamut within the order of things. We're going to be talking about gods. We're going to be talking about human beings. We're talking about the natural world. If you want to extend the idea of a character beyond, you know, human being, there are definitely all kinds of stories that involve. So, for example, a setting you could treat as a character if you wanted to start to push that notion. But certainly for us, we're going to have stories of gods and men, or gods and mankind, men and women. And they will be different types of characters with different attributes because of their different status within the order of things. Number 5, narrator. Notice this word is not narrative, it's narrator. And everybody knows what a narrator is. It's the person who tells the story. The person who tells the story. And we've talked about this already, that the person who tells the story could be involved in the events that they talk about. They could be a character in the story. They could be removed from the story with just a kind of distant view. They could know all the facts of the story. They could not know all the facts of the story. They could be a reliable narrator such that we are expected to accept what they say as true about the story. Or they could be a narrator who is not reliable, who we're supposed to come to the realization that what they're saying might not be a perfectly accurate characterization of what's going on, right? The narrator is telling a story. They're not giving us the events directly. They're being mediated to us. So when someone tells you about what happened this morning, even if they're trying to be as faithful to what happened this morning as possible, just like the newspaper trying to be as faithful as possible to the facts of what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The point is, they're still going to create a certain interpretation or a certain spin that's not going to be simply identical to the facts themselves. Right? The other important thing is, in general, it's very easy to confuse the narrator with the author. Let me say it again. It's very easy to confuse the narrator with the author, right? When there's a kind of narrator removed from the story itself. But a narrator is really a character. The narrator is not the author. In many cases, the narrator might have attributes of the biography of the author, but I think it's really dubious to make a preformed assumption that the narrator and the author really have something in common. If authors wanted to tell you about themselves directly and just about themselves, they would write nonfiction and they'd write a memoir. But when they write a novel and they have a narrator, it's because they're not interested in directly telling you about themselves. They're doing it through imaginary characters. That doesn't mean that the characters don't have a basis in real life. Of course they do. But what that relationship is between these characters in real life is never very clear. Number 6, narrative voice or perspective. We think of Rashomon here. A narrative voice or perspective has to do with how the story is told based on who is telling it. How the story is told based on who's telling it. Because as different people tell a story, how it's told is going to change, and therefore the meaning is going to change. So we saw that in this movie Rashomon. 4 people describe or narrate seeing the same event, and they all have different understandings of what happened because of their different perspectives that lend to different voices, just different ways of narrating. Number 7, conflict, right? That's not a challenging one, but let's be clear exactly about all the key aspects of conflict. Number 1, conflict is a problem, and we talked about how without a conflict there is not a story, because conflict seems to generate a story. If there's nothing happening, the grass is growing, we don't have a story. The particular thing is the conflict is the thing that creates the story, and then it propels the plot of the story forward as characters seek a resolution to the problem, right? So, for example, the problem of the story in Odysseus, in the Odyssey, is the conflict is that Odysseus is, number 1, he's not home, and he's having a tough time getting home. And that conflict creates a problem for all the main characters of the tale, right? And he tries to resolve the problem, which is he tries to get home, and the people who are already at his home try to resolve the fact that he's not there the best they can, right? So the important thing about conflict is it's a problem that propels the story forward and really creates the structure of the story as people respond to the problem. Because what are human beings? They're problem solvers. Once there's a problem, we try to grapple with it, either successfully or unsuccessfully, directly or indirectly. A theme, right? This is important. A theme is a distinctive and reoccurring dominant idea which suggests one of the core meanings of the text. Let's be clear. A theme is not the single main idea of a text. A theme is a distinctive and reoccurring dominant idea which suggests one of the core meanings of the text. In every given text, a couple things. There are many themes, right? There are many themes. And some are going to be more important and others less important. And then I'll also say that in any text, all the themes can be woven together. They all connect in one way or another, right? And then the last thing I want to say about theme is that an author, since you're reading fiction or poetry, and you're not having things explained to you or told, but rather shown, in that distinction Henry James made between the author showing you versus telling you. Fiction, poetry, literature, they're determined to show you rather than tell you, right? And why is that important? Because the author will not come out and say, and this is an important theme of my story, right? So, for example, what if the theme, one of the themes of the Odyssey or of the Adam and Eve story is love, right? The story doesn't come out and say, and now the theme of love will be on display as Adam interacts with Eve, or as Odysseus interacts with Penelope. No, what you're just going to see is it exemplified or illustrated, and you're going to have to infer that theme from the action happening. And you're going to have to say, oh, it's very clear that, let's say, love, or friendship, or good, or evil, or the battle between good and evil happens to be a really crucial theme of this passage, despite the fact that it's not explicitly stated. It's something that you have to interpret out of the text. Okay, last one here. Trope. It's an unusual word, but it actually means something pretty simple. A trope is just a figurative or metaphorical use of language, or the use of a word or expression, which includes all the different figures of speech. Figurative language has different figures of speech, like metaphor, simile, hyperbole, irony, sarcasm, and so on. So whenever you're using a word that's not being used in a literal way, right? It's raining cats and dogs, right? That's a trope. The cats and dogs part is a trope, because when we look out the window, we do not expect to see cats and dogs falling from the sky, right? It's a metaphor. Notice it doesn't say it's raining like cats and dogs. It's raining cats and dogs, right? It makes it, in the metaphor, taking out like and as makes it much more powerful and more direct, but also more mysterious and bizarre. Has anyone figured out why that is an expression? Like, what is it about cats and dogs that simulates or has properties that are then transferred to a storm, right? So a trope is just any figurative use of language. But of course, metaphor is kind of the most common one, and it comes in a variety of forms. So trope. Okay, so these are your terms, and this is what you're going to be quizzed on. And I will probably have a few extra credit words that are thrown into these various lectures, but these are the terms that you're expected to know. These are the 15 terms right here. So this is what you need to study, and this PowerPoint will be up on Blackboard so that you can prepare yourself properly and successfully for quiz 1. So as I tell my daughter, go get 'em, Tiger. Thank you.